Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co host, Cameron McAllister. In this episode, we talk about the sad event of the bombing of the fertility clinic in California, which took the life of the perpetrator. But then we consider the underlying philosophy that would motivate an action like this. And we also talk about how, on the one hand, it may look outrageous, but on the other hand, it actually makes cultural sense. And we'll dig into that. We think this will be helpful to you in opening our eyes to some of the common assumptions that sneak in and often mislead us. As always, if you find value in what we do, you can support us by going to www.toltogether.com and click the donate button. Also, like, subscribe, and write a review and tell others about us.
Cameron, I want to talk about a sad story. Talk about the bombing of the fertility clinic in Palm Springs. I guess over the weekend or Friday, and yeah, somebody died. So obviously the main story is sadness, but there's some also interesting ideas that were expressed in it that I think most people looking at the situation would be like, "Well, that's ridiculous." And I think we can shed some light on how it's not. I mean, it is ridiculous. The philosophy is ridiculous in some ways, but it's more common than we would recognize, and we're gonna look particularly at the idolization of consent as a foundation for moral reasoning and moral thinking. So, what happened here, just to catch everybody up to speed, is so you have an explosion outside of a fertility clinic, and very early on, it wasn't really known what happened at the place or what this was about. And I think there was a sense in the news that it was like, oh, this is another one of those, pro life people trying to blow up a Planned Parenthood place or something like that. The New York Times very quickly, had a lot of like, well, this is a very LGBTQ friendly area. And so this is probably, you're like, well, what does that have to do with anything? And then it turns out that this wasn't a pro life terrorist. This was an anti life terrorist. And
Hmm.
the reason that we can frame it in that way is that anytime that somebody kills somebody else to show that they're pro life, everybody's like, there's a massive internal contradiction here. How can you be pro life and killing people like that? Is an internal inconsistency and incoherence. However, the philosophy is best we understand it from the young man who's involved in this, and he was the sole person who died in this. Not exactly sure what all he was trying to do. He had guns and created a massive explosion with a vehicle, but his name is Guy Bartkus. So this guy's name is Guy. So if that gets confusing as we're discussing this, but he is part of a broader anti-natalist. So you can think of a pro-natalist movement that would be, for birth, and this is against that. And it's within it's a subset of he referred to himself as a pro-mortalist. So you can think of a pro-lifer, you would be for life. If you're a pro-mortalist, you're for death. So blowing yourself up and trying to take as much life with you as you do that is a totally consistent. He is acting consistently with the way that he saw the world. And the summary of what we know best at this point, and so some things may change, but from what he has written thus far, that we can see there were kind of four key aspects of his pro-mortalism that were expressed in this event. So the first one is an opposition to procreation. So this is just a sentiment of being anti bringing new life into the world, particularly with the justification that bringing new life into the world inherently introduces suffering. So
Hmm.
suffering is gonna come back on this. So you're anti, and so there would be reasons for being anti-natalist. You could say overpopulation, climate change. There have been all kinds of reasons for this in the past, but it seems like this one is linked to you're bringing suffering into the world if you bring human life into the world. Um, and the second one is a corollary of that of the belief in the inevitability of suffering. So he's believing that life is inherently pointless and only leads to death and suffering and should be ended as soon as possible. So there are people who would I think that as terms of a more suicide sort of thing, that they would think their own life is pointless and suffering, and that's tragic. This one is saying that all life leads to pointless suffering and death. Um, Number three would be a deep anger at existence in general, um, being brought into existence without consent. This is the one that we want to lean into, and that he's you're brought into life without you don't get to choose to be born. You're brought into life without consent into a world of inherent suffering, and that's what life entails. And then number 4 would be an opposition to in vitro fertilization. And so that's why he specifically targeted a clinic that would be full of embryos, viewing it as kind of the epitome of a pro-life ideology. So he's seeing IVF as a very pro-life thing, and if you're a pro-mortalist, that's like the I don't know, the sanctuary of your opposition, so to speak. And
Mhm.
so blowing yourself up outside of a fertility clinic and trying to take as many other embryos with you as possible is the logical conclusion of this framework. So it's tricky here because you're going to be like, well, this is dumb. It doesn't make any sense. And we're going to argue for a split second. And this makes perfect
Mhm.
sense if this is what you believe about the world. And so it raises a whole lot of interesting questions, Cameron. I think in the category of in vitro fertilization, is an embryo a life? Was he attempting to murder humans? He was certainly trying to prevent more lives. Um, and I don't know if we'll get into the weeds in all of this, but um, maybe as we get going, bring this back into the idea of being born without consent into a life that is
Mhm.
inherently full of suffering would be a starting point. But just real quick, is there anything from the story that I left out that you want to add, or anything in my summary of it that you would want clarification on?
No, I mean, I think that's a pretty clear summary of everything that transpired there.
So, what do we to the person who is listening to this and is feeling like, okay, you don't consent to being born. That's ridiculous. Of course you don't. That's normal. Help
Mhm.
us with this next step here of where would you see Cameron help the person who's like this is totally ridiculous. How do we get to
Yeah,
this place where the
yeah.
consent not to be born even is a
Mhm.
phrase that somebody would think of, much less act on?
Mhm. I think 2 things. First of all, consistency is not always a good thing. I like the example that Peter Kraft gives here. He'll say, "Well, consistency is overrated." There might be somebody who is locked up in an institution maintaining, "I'm the Lord Jesus Christ," or "I'm Napoleon Bonaparte," and very fiercely consistent on that conclusion. Anybody who presents any kind of counter evidence, "Oh, you would say that because you're all in on the elaborate plot to conceal the fact from the world that I am in fact Napoleon Bonaparte or I am the Lord Jesus Christ." So there are delusional forms of very profound consistency in the sense that you have some sort of internally consistent vision that may be nevertheless delusional or entirely out of touch with reality. So let's just state that for the record, and let's give common sense its, sort of some of its due deference. But that said, we need to think about the world in which we live. And this is where I think a notion like a plausibility structure or the phrase plausibility structure can be very helpful. So, our sociologist friends can help us here. What's a plausibility structure? It's just an overall framework that's taken for granted. And within that framework, you get many assumptions and norms that are simply taken for granted. So, when we think about what some of our resting assumptions are culturally speaking right now, something like this make begins to make some more sense. So, I would say that one of and I'm gonna use just very everyday language now to make this I want this to be as practical and just hands-on as possible. But one of our major assumptions these days is just that we're basically human beings are in control.
Oh,
We're in charge.
can I give you
Yeah, please do.
a funny example of this,
Go ahead, yes.
and to show you how ingrained this is in our culture? So our elementary school, this is a few years back. I think my son would have been in, let's say, 1st grade. The school got a new principal. So we all know what an elementary school principal is. And I said to my kids, "You have a new school principal. It's Mrs. Such and such." And my first-year-old said, "What? They didn't ask me about it. I didn't decide that."
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
as a parent, you're like, "That's a like, in what world would you think I get to decide who my, school principal is as a 1st grader nonetheless?"
Mhm.
But
Yep.
is that the zeitgeist, Cameron? Is that where you're headed here?
Oh, I think it's the very air we breathe. And even if you so in if we take some examples from our neck of the woods, the world of apologetics, think about the way questions are raised these days. So a common question that comes up is, what kind of an egotistical maniac is God that he would demand worship? There's one. and I'll explain in a second why that's the framing of that is very interesting. Another one is, and I've literally heard this before, if God is real, then he's got a lot of explaining to do.
Mhm. Mhm.
And you just take a few steps back and you say, wait, no, hold on. If God is indeed real, if we're talking about the Christian God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, who answers to Moses from the burning bush, I am that I am, then the precise opposite would be the case. You would be answerable to him. He wouldn't be answerable to you. You could just take a look at the book of Job and see his response to Job to get kind of a very
Uh,
beautiful poetic crash course in how, no, the creature speaking to the creator does not demand of the creator reasons or that the creator meet him on his own terms or her own terms. So again, the very framing of some of these issues shows that our resting assumption is we're in charge. I mean, when I pushed back and said something like this to somebody in a conversation recently, his answer was, he said, God needs to present lots more evidence to me. And I said, what would count as evidence for you? Well, anything that would hold up in a court of law. Okay. So, so God is judged by the standards of a human court from beings he possibly created. Do you see anything wrong with the way you framed this issue in the first place?
Well, other than yeah, I'm sure that person on other occasions has not thought that our judicial system is perfect anyway, so there's that.
Of course. Yeah. Right.
But let's warp this back around then into one of the clearest places where this is manifest itself as in sexual ethics. So,
Yeah.
and multiple people have pointed this out in numerous books, but the idea that consent is the boundary is where we draw our boundaries morally, sexually based on consent. And so this is a two consenting adults who can say anything against it. Now we're running into a deeper philosophical argumentation of saying, actually, there are things that we don't ask our children to consent to, eat your broccoli, whatever, go to school, that are good
Yep.
for them. That consent, we don't use that for children. But what if you have a child who is old enough to consent? And so this is where the idea of sticking the P in with LGBTQP. So for pedophilia, of saying,
Yep.
what if a 14-year-old says, yeah, I consent to XYZ with my math teacher or whatever else, if consent
Mhm.
is the defining line, and hey, that student is old enough to decide to physiologically change their body, they can identify as something else anyway. Why would we not afford them the same
Mhm.
foundation of their consent using their bodies in other ways? There's that, and then there's the other philosophical argumentation on bestiality and whether or not an animal can give consent to a sexual relationship, and that is seen as the primary argumentation there for whether or not that's an appropriate way to express yourself. And so we're
Now
not
let
getting
me
into the weeds on all of that, just to say that consent is
yeah.
the key concept that's used in all of these moral distinguishing situations.
And lest you think Nathan is going down some slippery slope here, one of our so we tend to think we're in charge of everything. We're in control, we're in charge, we call the shots. Now I'm gonna bring in an argument here from a philosopher named Simon May, and I think he's right on this, but you need to, test this out in your own mind and see what you think of it. But he argues that the key substitute for God and for religion in the West now is love. And specifically, a love predicated on the Judeo Christian God. That is, love that is unconditional, selfless, disinterested, and all affirming. So these are qualities that, if you really press into them, you'll realize that, well, only a divine being is capable of these. And his explicit argument is that we're trying to play God here, little love gods. But if we're doing that, if again we think we're in charge here, then the notion of anybody imposing rules or boundaries on our sexual activities or sexual expression would be received as an affront by us because, after all, we're the authors of love in our own minds. The
Mm,
cultural logic is such that we call the shots here. But
yeah.
you're finding now that that is increasingly difficult to establish, and you have this inherently ambiguous term consent, because another problem that you run into with consent is it's two consenting adults until one of them, often a woman, changes her mind. That's happening as well. And so then the whole consent thing starts to break down there. So there's that inherent ambiguity. Somebody changes their mind, and now there are legal troubles. But also, yeah, so we have everything from bestiality to polyamorous relationships, all of and I would say incest is on the docket as well. Because again, if you have a view that says, "We decide, we're in charge," and as long as you have people who are consenting and who are exercising their freedom, and that's another really important one, freedom to, do as we please, so long as we don't hurt anybody else, then why would you impose any limits, and who's to say that we ought to stop?
So is the so so some of you are listening to this and might be getting confused and thinking we're making an argument about sexual ethics, and we're using this as an example of showing the degree to
It's
which
an outworking. Yeah.
of a culture of consent and of freedom. And I think there would be a logical conclusion here in the many theistic way in which we view ourselves, that the ultimate expression of our freedom would to be to take ourselves out of existence.
Yes,
This
absolutely.
this is an interesting argument, running this back in the other direction to say, I did not consent to be born.
And I've heard that
Um,
many times. I'm sure you have too, Nathan.
yeah, I mean, so that kind of just, I'm saying
I
that's
didn't choose to be
not that
born. Yep.
shocking of a statement if you live in a world where consent is lifted up as the pinnacle justification for anything. And the fact of the matter is, you absolutely did not consent to be born.
There not only that, so I think the 3 kind of major features of our cultural assumptions about the world and how we ought to live revolve around love, freedom, and happiness. Love is basically, yeah, I've named that in a previous podcast, and I just did now too. It's kind of a humanized version of divine love. Freedom, a kind of a negative freedom where we sort of are allowed to do whatever we please, unfettered, completely unconstrained, so long as we don't hurt anybody else. That's where you run into tensions with freedom, by the way.
Mm. But
So long as you don't hurt, because
but that's a
and
uniquely
then
modern one too, because historically
absolutely it is. Yeah.
freedom was like, I can do what I can get away with.
Mhm. Well, and also
Who cares about how
historically,
anybody else feels about it?
yes, and historically also freedom had to do with a positive vision. It wasn't just limited to Christianity, but an actual, you had some sort of shared project that was bigger than yourself, whether that was serving your country. You think about a martial society like ancient Greece, and so where a notion of kind of heroism, or even just don't even think about being a hero. I mean, that's an exotic example. Just being a good citizen. You're or you're in a kind of shame and honor culture in the Middle East where family is everything. Being a good son, being a good daughter, and but that's part. I mean, your freedom consists in your ability to express your proper devotion and fidelity and fulfill your family obligations and duties. Now, that sounds completely foreign to us today, but again, just to show you how the notion of freedom to be whatever you want to be and follow your dreams and whatever whims kind of crop up in your heart, that is distinctly modern. But not also, and this comes in big, actually, in a big way, the notion that of happiness, that you should just be safe and secure all the time and feel good all the time, this is sort of subjective satisfaction. So some anti-natalist philosophy, if you peer down these really darkened corridors, you're going to find arguments like human consciousness is an aberration. And the argument there is that because you are self-aware, your self-awareness comes with a massive price, and that is the price of experiencing suffering on a level that no tiger or no amoeba ever will. You are
Mm.
self-aware of your suffering, and because of that, it makes and some of us, experience absolutely horrendous things that are, meaning destroying and paradigm shattering, and some
Well,
people experience disease and rape, and so therefore now, yeah, so this is just to tell you that, I mean, if you again, we're trying to make it clear that this line of thinking is arises within a distinct framework that puts humanity at the very center of reality.
yeah,
It's
it's
not to say that suffering
anthropocentric
is
to the
real.
core.
Correct. I mean, suffering is real, and people do experience horrendous, horrendous, I mean, events in their lives, of course. I mean, this world is filled with that, but if you're if your expectations and your basic orientation take into account that the world is punctuated by suffering and that that is a normal part of this side of eternity, you don't even necessarily have to be a Christian to think in these terms, that human beings are flawed and that their human error is a fact of life. It need not produce insurmountable kind of mental suffering for you. But if you do see yourself as completely at the center of everything and you see yourself basically as a little god who shouldn't have to feel any pain or suffering and nothing should transpire that you didn't have a say in, I mean, then you are set up
So
for, I mean, that's a very bizarre assumption given the
I think
prevailing reality of life.
so I think that is there's a so here, two questions or one question and an observation or two observations. I don't know why this kind of thing doesn't happen more often. It makes a sad
Right.
sense to
Yes,
to
I'm
me
totally with you on that.
to
Yep.
me looking at what I know about how people
Thank
are
God it
operating right
doesn't.
now.
Yes.
Yeah, well, so I think, yeah, there's a divine hand at play in staying some of this, and the fact that people aren't living consistently within the way in which they're viewing the world is
Thank
there.
God for that too.
Thank God for that too, and we as Christians are happy to loan, um,
Yes.
but here's the here
Take the borrowed credit.
yeah,
Please don't hurt
borrow, yeah,
yourself and
yeah,
hurt other
yeah,
people. Yes,
s
take it.
and, I think I told this story before on here of talking to a young lady one night who was trying to be on the way out, and I was trying to talk her out of it, and she was like,
Mm,
fully embracing this mindset, and I said, "Y based on what the way you're looking at the world, you don't have a reason not to kill yourself." But I said, "You need to doubt whether or not you fully understand reality." And I said, "I see a higher value and meaning in your life right now than you can, and I'm happy to loan you my faith that there's a bigger purpose to your life than what you see right now, and you can use it
mm,
until you get to the point where you can see it for yourself." And so that was an instance where I
mm.
very clearly understood that she clearly understood that, and from the framework she was arguing from, that made sense. And I was saying, I acknowledge that. However, I don't
Yep.
think you're seeing the full picture here. So you need to doubt because of the finality of what you're trying to decide. You need to doubt that you really have this all wrapped up
Look,
as a 19-year-old. Um, and so I was attempting to do that loan, so to speak, of saying,
yeah.
I think there's a meaning to your life that I can see from where I'm at. So I think so I s 2 things are true. 1, the reason I'm surprised that we don't see this happen more often. The thing that keeps it from happening more often, other than praise the Lord in a lot of people's lives, is that the way in which I'm saying somebody who's inhabiting this framework is thinking about it is that I create my own meaning. So that's again, that's a self-deification thing.
Yep.
And so
Yep.
there is a meaning that I make. It and we're told that we can make our own meaning, but as soon as we recognize the fallacy of or our inability to make our own meaning, then I think this is where this takes off. And so I think making your own meaning doesn't make any sense, but people are still trying to do it. So as soon as people stop trying to make their own meaning and recognize the logical conclusion of this, then I think this is the sad outworking of this. And so we're going to go back to one of our favorite thinking out loud quotes where this shouldn't surprise us. We can be sad and we can be sorry, but we shouldn't be surprised. And the conversation we're having here is just helping you process this as a type of thing that is already latently infected into the culture around us.
And the cultural logic here is very deep. It's extremely deep-seated, and it's helping people to see that our own meaning-making projects, some people who are very consistent, can't succeed on those terms. It's helping people to understand that, wait, what if there's a different understanding of all of the best parts of life? What if there's a different understanding of love? What if there's a different understanding of freedom? What if there's a different understanding of happiness? What if happiness is more than just subjective satisfaction? There's
What if there's an
drama.
answer to what if there's an answer to suffering?
What if there's an answer to suffering? And what if your suffering, as severe as it can be, is not forever, but
But
instead
what if death
temporary?
isn't the end of suffering?
Yes. And what if death isn't the end of suffering? What if suffering, as severe as it is, can even play with your cooperation a role in refining you and making you better. Some of the best, most wise people have been saying that down the ages. And I've met people who have come out of the other side of suffering or gone through great suffering and are in the midst of great suffering who are absolute marvels. It hasn't crushed
Mhm.
them. It hasn't embittered them. It hasn't made them say, well, I never chose to be born. So there are other ways to see. The problem is sometimes we get trapped in these perspectives. Let's go back to Peter Kreeft's example. I mean, again, to that patient suffering under delusions of grandeur in some institution, but very, very consistent in their whole vision and outlook of this delusion. There are very elaborate delusions, especially when they're centered on idolatry. And for a long time, we've been idolizing humanity. I mean, that's if you really want to look at one of the most if we wanna state one of the clearest idols of the modern era, it would be the idolization of humanity, seeing
So,
human beings as the measure of all things.
but it's a interesting so and treading very carefully here because we're talking about a young man who's died or killed himself trying
Mhm,
to kill
mhm.
others. Um,
Yeah,
so there's a sensitivity to it. There is a component of me, Cameron, that and I understand mental health is a serious thing. I'm trying to figure out the way in which this plays into here you have a young man who lives in California and owns a car.
mhm,
I think that there are about 7 billion people on the planet who would look at him and say, "You don't know what suffering is."
right.
And so there's
Yeah,
there's a way in which the the
yeah,
inward curl of focus onto self shuts us out from the suffering of others in a way that makes it seem like our suffering is
mhm,
uniquely justifies crazy actions on the other side of it that,
mhm.
is a byproduct of anyway, you see where I'm going there.
Well, no, there's some bit so there's an interesting distinction to be made here. So there are people who are in places of destitution, right? Poverty, and their suffering is very much constituted by a struggle to survive, a struggle to survive, to get food, to deal with
Yeah, but they're
disease,
trying to
to
survive, and here's somebody who's trying not to survive.
and that animates their efforts. But then and I mean, a lot of people have looked into this. There's a different form of psychic pain that happens when people are living in relative affluence and luxury, but feel that they have no meaning in life and feel empty. And this is why you see some of these instances of people who are recruited by, radical Islamist sects. A lot of them come from, upper middle class areas, or you see something, I mean, even like a lot of terrorist activities, shootings, the Columbine shooting involved two upper middle class Caucasian, very smart boys, who were and there's a lot there. I don't wanna impose some grand theory on these atrocities, but I do see some inward twisting that happens when we are suffering psychically because we're starved of meaning and we're living more and more selfishly, and that tends to twist into sometimes very dark impulses to lash out and pull off some kind of stunt, something that hurts a lot of people, something that makes a major statement. But yeah, I don't know that I'm making that
Well,
much sense other than that there's forms of suffering that erupt when we have a meaning collapse, and it
well,
can turn very bad. Yeah.
so there's a I'm trying to think of examples historically where okay, let's say you have somebody who is physically suffering, famine, um,
Mhm.
war, famine yeah, response, and this is happening around the world around us, who
Yep.
aren't struggling for meaning in their life. They're struggling to actually stay alive,
Mhm.
and they aren't going out and just trying to blow themselves up and take as many people with them as a statement against something. It,
Mhm.
the meaning famine leads to higher forms of extremism. It almost so a shortage of meaning in our lives and our inability to, starving for meaning has more explosive,
Deleterious effects. Oh, yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
psychologically on
Yep.
the,
Yep.
like, it sounds that those words sound feel bad coming
But
out of my mouth because I'm not
think about it.
minimizing famine. I'm just saying that as
No, but think about it
meaning-seeking
like this.
creatures, we have to have it as much as we have to have calories.
A struggle for survival, though, you have a telos, you've got an aim, you've got an objective. You really don't have the luxury of worrying about the meaning of your life in those circumstances.
And you
You know,
can have bitterness toward whoever you think is starving you out. Sure, there's that kind of
of
thing,
course,
but that's
we well,
different.
we don't want to romanticize people in destitution and poverty. Yeah, absolutely. There's so the human factor remains the human factor there, but the fact of the matter remains a kind of meaning crisis that would cause. I mean, think about also this might sound crude, but I don't think it is. You need resources, you need wealth to pull off these kinds of terroristic stunts. I mean, even if
Mhm,
you think about you need access to guns, you need access to explosives, you need vehicles you can blow up. I mean, so you have to have at your disposal resources. You've got to have at your disposal leisure time in which to do the research, to construct this stuff, to plan it. All of that. I mean, think about the amount of effort and coordination that goes into to these
yeah,
different kinds of. In fact, a cynical part of me, I'm very grateful we don't see more of this kind of thing. By God's grace, we don't see more of this kind of thing. There's also a cynical side of me that says a lot of people are simply too lazy to put in the work to do these kinds of to pull off these kinds of stunts,
mhm.
which is a dark thing to say, but I think that
W
really is true. There's a lot of work and resources and money that go into these, but a crisis of meaning is very serious, and it can have we can't live without meaning, and a mind deprived of meaning will break.
So
And so yeah.
can we bring this back around though, just to say that I any is it true, Cameron, that anything that is truly meaningful, and I'm putting shared meaning. So I want to modify something I've said. I think we've said in the past, like we're meaning seeking creatures. I don't think we're just looking for meaning. I think we're looking for shared meaning.
Yeah.
So meaning is a step, but we're looking to a meaning that we can share with somebody else. We are inherently communal creatures,
Mhm.
and I think that replicates the image of the God in which we've been created. But the idea here that in order to have a meaning that can be shared, there are terms of participation in that meaning that can't come down to my individual decision making and consent. That I will always be implicated and be on the receiving end of decisions that other people have made, or the wants and wishes and wills of other people, or dare we say, God. Um,
Mhm.
and so there's no such thing as a shared meaning that fully has the consent of everyone. Gotta think through that. Does that sound right? Like, because I have my wants and
We
wishes have to be warped
we
and conform to the shape of others as we go along here.
Of course, but we actually don't want that. We think we want that. We think we want everything to conform to our own wishes. But in the rare scenarios where somebody has a certain arrangement where they get virtually everything that they want, it's usually a hellish experience and very lonely. We're
Mhm.
made because we're made to go beyond our own wishes and whims and fantasies. In fact, our own whims and wishes and fantasies are petty little things. They're empty. We think they're not at first, but then we very quickly discover that they are. We're made for more than that. We're actually made for communion with the Lord of all creation. So, it's good for us. We might kick and scream, but it's good for us to be pulled beyond our own little preferences. We've
So
got to get our own personal preferences cannot be our whole world.
so can all right, let me take that and run an argument backwards and zigzag here a second. So here we have an expression of saying we you don't consent to being to existing. That's a statement. Fact, everybody
Mhm.
nod along. You don't consist of that. Do you is there a way though in which you hear the phrase like, "Oh, I don't want to have children because I could never bring children into this world of suffering."
Mhm.
That also is a if we're worried about the consent of the unborn, that's prioritizing your consent. Like, is there the same ethical, I mean, other than the fact that you have no way of articulating what you would like to consent to before you exist, you're imposing your will upon the non-existence of somebody who maybe very well would like a chance to exist and to take a hand at the suffering of the world. Like, we're making it sound like it's a noble thing when our consent is depriving somebody else of the choice of consenting to something.
It's
And I mean,
fundamentally flawed
quickly you
from
get into the pro-life, pro-choice distinction here on who can consent and who can't. But let's just be consistent one way or the other.
I mean, we in a sense, the whole "I didn't choose to be born" makes cultural sense, but in another sense, it's nonsense. I mean, you can't give voice to the thought itself. You can't even express any of this apart from the privilege and the gift of existence itself, which allows you the ability to express the thought in the first place. You're a person. You're a creature. The question that kind of statement is a statement of somebody who's mistaking themselves for a god, and you're not a god. And so we just and there's a sense in which we need to just get back in touch with reality and exercise some epistemic humility when it comes to the quality of our own lives, and even bringing other human beings into the world as though we call that shot. It's ours. You know, we're the ones in charge of population control and all that. Again, these are the thoughts of somebody who's thinking of themselves as a god. You're
How
not.
do we So let's say something though to bring this to a close, of saying that I think the reason that we got to a cultural deification of consent is that it is a warped byproduct of a very good thing of recognizing that humans do have real value, worth. Our decisions do matter. We are called to make choices. We've been endowed by our creator with the capacity to shape and form and craft the world around us. We do matter as individuals. Our thinking oftentimes is part of the divine and sacred will of what needs to happen in the world. And so all of those gifts and skills and abilities and the latent value of what it means to be human and to make decisive and discerning choices in the world are good. So what we're not calling here for, like, oh, we just need people who don't think about anything and then everything will be okay. That's not it at all. It's saying that all of that package of what it means to be human really only makes sense in relationship to something that isn't human, in order for it to have its boundaries and its meta narrative, to use the old school word there,
Hmm.
to make sense of it. And so it's actually when we take the gifts that God has given us and detach them from the God who is real, that we produce this idolatrous focus on the gift rather than on the giver, that almost always inherently destroys itself and brings about our own death and the death of others around us. And so it's a decoupling of the gift from the giver, of the meaning from the maker, that leads to this confusion. And so I think when we see things like this isn't something to be mad about. It's not something to be scared about. It's just to grieve at the brokenness that we see in the world around us. And we have means of making sense of this. And we also then, I think it should push us, Cameron, as Christians, to continue compulsively to lean into our missional outreach to say there are people in the world who are scrambling for another way of answering that long list of questions that we gave in the middle of the podcast. And we see inherently on the other side of it that it's good. And the interesting thing is that Christianity brings into this is that suffering is not the end necessarily, and that non existence is not the answer to suffering. That restoration, restitution, redemption, renewal, reconciliation are all possible things that come out of difficulty and lead to more glorious things on the other side. And so let's keep telling that story and casting that vision and painting that picture of, is there suffering in this world? Yes, absolutely. Is that defining characteristic of all of reality? Absolutely not. Is non-existence the solution to that? It's not. There's more. And so it just simply doesn't go far enough. And so that's the role that I think we have as Christians, is to tell the bigger story, to invite people into the bigger house, and to pull more people into a deeper sense of community with God and with each other than they currently think is possible. And that love, not fear, is what motivates, I think, the church to continue to do the work that Christ emulated and commanded us to do, because it really does matter. Jesus says, "The thief came to steal, kill, and destroy, and I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." And so, fullness of life is the opposite of meaninglessness. And if you're standing on that solid rock, that's a good place to throw life preservers from in a weary world. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.